Emily, welcome to the show. This book is much about China's future as it's also about its presence. It's told through the eyes of those risking everything so to remain true to themselves. I wanted to start off with the title of the book. Let's Only Red Flowers Bloom. What does it mean, and how did you arrive to it?
The title is a reference to a slogan from 1950s China during Chairman Mao's period, where he says at one point, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. And he wanted to hear dissenting ideas. And then very quickly he changes his mind. And infamously, if you study modern Chinese history, he clamps down on everyone who has just spoken out and describes it later as a bit of a trap. That phrase, though, has become often repeated in China, in Chinese. And when I was interviewing one of the characters who ended up becoming someone big in the book, they said to me when describing their predicament, they had been a publisher before, but now were facing increasing political constraints in China. They said to me in Mandarin, before the state wanted all kinds of flowers, but now the state will only let red flowers bloom. Making an allusion, of course, to that Mao era slogan of letting 100 flowers bloom. And that stuck with me. It was the working title for the book when I was writing it. Thought about changing it at one point. I never did, so that's the title of the book.
Right. Now you open up this book through with a tense moment at the Beijing's airport that you were stopped there, and you described the sort of the process that you go through when traveling to and from China. What was going through your mind at that moment, and how did that experiences really shape the book?
China has been closing the space for civil liberties, for journalism, both for foreign correspondents and for Chinese journalists. And the trends were starting basically from the moment that I moved to China in mid 2015. Looking back, I realize now I moved to China literally the week after something called the 705 Lawyers Crackdown, where about 300 human rights lawyers, people who are working on serious legal reform cases, highly influential, were suddenly arrested and detained. And in the years since, they've been disbarred or imprisoned. So I moved to China at the beginning of a period of closing down. Previously, there had been decades of opening up politically. And I was covering the Hong Kong protests in 2019 to early 2020. And increasingly, as I left mainland China and was going to Hong Kong and then coming back from Hong Kong to mainland China, I was getting stopped at the airport. And I describe one of these experiences in the Beijing airport coming back from Hong Kong. And so basically, all signs were pointing to the fact that not only was reporting in China becoming more difficult, the overall space for freedom of expression, for any kind of critical thought, really, and independent organizing was shrinking. And I might be facing a future pretty soon where I might not be allowed to live and report in China. And so I started thinking about ways to continue to report on China and keep my connection to this country, which I still very much care about, alive, even if I couldn't be there. And that is unfortunately what ended up happening in 2020 when I left for a vacation and I was not allowed to go back as an NPR correspondent. So I moved to neighboring Taiwan. But that's when I started writing the book. But the book really came about as a way to think about reporting on China, as increasingly, not just me, but other journalists are not able to be on the ground there.
How did your reporting process shift when you could no longer be on the ground in China, and what challenges that came to did that present to you?
Most of the reporting for the book I had done already before I left China. And part of the book takes us outside of the People's Republic of China. So it brings us to Hong Kong, then it brings us to Taiwan, my home for the last 2 years. And then the book ends with questions of identity and politics among the Chinese diaspora who are living in the US. And so I wanted to think about reporting on China as a global project, not just one that you have to do on the ground in China, but examining, for example, the influence that China has economically, culturally, politically, is now global. It's certainly regional in the Asia Pacific, but I think it reaches to Europe, to North America, in both good and bad, productive and unproductive ways. And these questions of Chinese identity, how China sees itself, how it's constructing a more Communist Party centric identity, that's happening not just in China itself, but we're seeing the ripple effects around the world. So the book broadens what I think is possible in reporting on China, making it a global story, but also decentering Chinese identity as something that's not just happening within the People's Republic of China, this political entity, but something that's happening all over the world.
Right. Now, how did you choose which whose stories to tell in the book? You follow a couple of people in the book and tell their stories, but how was that decision made?
I wanted to broadly interpret identity. So I profile characters who, through their lives and through their eyes, you get a sense of issues like gender, language, ethnicity, but also maybe less obvious aspects of identity, political values and visions for the country, visions for how China should develop economically. It's nominally a socialist country that basically has no tie whatsoever to actual communism. It's a highly capitalistic, highly unequal society. But through individual people and their lived experience, show how there have always been a diversity of opinion, of identity, of different types of people who have existed in China. How even the project of China as an empire and now a modern nation state has always been contested, and that's a strength, not a weakness.
Now, you mentioned a love for the country despite, repression. Can you talk about sort of the emotional contradiction, like missing China while being banned from it?
I describe China like it it was an abusive ex-partner or something. You both have nostalgia for it, but at the same time, in some respects, it's treated you really, really badly. But that's the allure of China, going back to explorers who were trying to trek into China when its borders were closed, to traders and would-be colonizers who were trying to break into the China market back when it was illegal to teach non-Chinese people Chinese. China's always, in some ways, been this closed off civilization that people on the outside have a fascination with. And obviously, I have a personal tie. My parents were born and raised in China. They were first generation immigrants to the US. And so I straddle these two worlds of both being an American and identifying quite strongly with Chinese culture, but not with the political project that is modern day China. And I wanted to show all those ambiguities. And also, if you're not a China watcher, you don't keep up with news about China, that's fine. I hope that the characters in this book are entertaining, dramatic, scintillating to read about because they are people and they've been through some pretty tragic, dramatic, extreme stories that I think will illuminate the human condition no matter who you are.
What conversation do you hope this book starts among readers in the US or elsewhere when who may not see how these, identity policies in China affect the world?
First of all, I think identity is central to many of the main policies that we've seen come out of China. So this emphasis on national security, on these draconian ethnic policies on minorities in regions like Xinjiang, for example, in Western China that have hit the mainstream news, that ultimately comes down to concerns with consolidating Chinese identity and excluding people who don't fit that definition. But I also hope that when people read this book, they realize China is not a monolith, that the Chinese people are not a cohesive entity. They're not all alike. There's, in fact, extraordinary range in the languages and the identities and the politics and viewpoints of 1.3 billion people living in China, many of whom don't fit in with how the state defines its aims and what it means to be a good Chinese citizen. And so, in the context of, say, US politics, when we're thinking about, for example, there's now a House bill in the House of Representatives to ban all Chinese students from getting visas to study in the US. Is that productive to think about an entire group of people and dealing with them in the same way, when in fact there's huge organic diversity in the people who are born and raised in the People's Republic of China?
Right. Now, I just want to pull back the curtain a little bit here. You're a reporter, obviously, award-winning reporter for NPR. How was the process of doing your job as a reporter and also writing this book at the same time?
I I like writing, so it was fun for me. I don't know if I'd feel that way with another book project. Honestly, writing the book was kind of like therapy. I had just sold the book when I found out that I was not going to be able to go back to China after what I thought was a vacation. And I'd lived in China for 7 years at that point, and my work is very important to me. So it was a huge blow in terms of work, in terms of purpose, in terms of my personal life, in terms of my identity, to not be able to go back in the interim as a journalist to this country that I'd invested so much time in. And I ended up writing most of the book in Taiwan. And it made me realize that my time in China, although it was cut short, was meaningful. I met people who I will never forget. Their stories stay with me, and that's why I wanted to put them in this book.
Now, as China becomes more closed off to foreign reporters, how do you think international understanding of China is changing or being distorted?
It is becoming flatter and more shallow. So we still have foreign reporters who are based there, and there are a lot of Chinese journalists, of course, who cover their own country. But for the former, they're so stretched thin. There are fewer and fewer foreign correspondents in China, especially for American media, because the Chinese government is not giving us visas. And so, if you had to pick and choose, you only have time to cover the news stories. You don't have time to take 4 weeks off to do a long form report or an investigative report because you have maybe a fourth of the headcount that you had, even compared to 5 or 6 years ago. For Chinese journalists, they have faced so much political constraints and censorship that it's very, very hard for them to do independent reporting, even though there are very talented and motivated people who want to do that reporting. It just doesn't see the light of day. Meanwhile, China can pick up an American newspaper, they can listen to your radio station, they can go onto the NPR website, and they can learn everything they want about the US because we still have a free press. And so there's an enormous information asymmetry where they know a lot about us because we write about ourselves, we are often self critical, and we don't have that access in China. And I still report on China from outside of China, but it's not the same as being on the ground. There were so many stories where I didn't know if I could get information or talk to people. It was only by going to a place physically and testing out my luck and running into people and through them finding more people that I ended up being able to report the story. And that's happening less and less.
Right. Actually, I was going to ask you that. Now that you're outside of China, how has your sort of your understanding of the country evolved, and what do you hope readers will take away with about its people?
I'm missing context. I'm sure I could do more sound rich stories, more human centered stories if I were there. And also, honestly, the news appetite has shifted. There is so much happening in the US that I think if you're a journalist working for an American outlet, a lot of the focus has to be on what's happening in the US and as it relates to American politics. And that's further diminished editorial appetite for something more long form, not necessarily news driven from China. It's harder to ask for that space to do something about people in China simply because they're interesting, not because they have anything to do with the US China relationship, unfortunately.
Right. Now, I know we're running out of time here, but I just want to ask you about some of the stories in the book. You have the stories about Hong Kong protesters, inner Mongolian teachers. I want to see how that sort of connects to the broader story of China's global ambitions.
China has regional ambitions. It would like to be the superpower within the Asia Pacific. And it's very, very annoyed that the US is basically a Pacific superpower as well because of our military and economic projection. For Hong Kong, that is a legacy of this colonial trauma with the two opium wars that the British and various allies, including the US, fought and won and wrested extremely unfair concessions from China in the 1800s. And so getting Hong Kong under Chinese communist control has been a chip on Beijing's shoulder, but it's also, the way that Hong Kong has been mismanaged over the last few decades under Beijing's rule. At the time, many Hong Kongers felt Chinese when they were given over to Chinese control. They did not feel British. They felt like British colonial subjects, but they very much identified with the Chinese nation building project. But the Communist Party has so mismanaged that's created these groundswells of dissent against Beijing. And why has Beijing been so heavy handed with Hong Kong? I think it ultimately comes down to identity. It's this idea of trying to mold what is a uniquely Hong Kong set of values into the party project of what China should be, making it like any other Chinese city, letting mainland people go and buy houses there and move there when it's even hard for a Hong Konger to buy an apartment. That's created these economic issues that has then engendered these protests that has then given Beijing an excuse to crack down even more legally and politically. that give you an idea, I think, of the often very inflexible and reactionary way that the Communist Party rules that creates more problems for itself often down the road. Um, I don't think that what Beijing did in Hong Kong necessarily applies to any of its global ambitions, but it does give you a sense of their decision making process. There is no tolerance for risk, for any kind of openness, because they would rather clamp down and have absolute control and kill off innovation and dynamism in the process than to risk letting that happen, but also risk any kind of dissent.
Right. Now you end the book um, reflecting on the different ideas of what China means to different people. Now you now living outside of China, what does being Chinese mean to you?
That's a very good question, and I think it differs from various people who self identify as Chinese in some way. First of all, I mean, I identify as Chinese culturally because I've spent a lot of time learning and speaking Mandarin. But not all people who self identify as Chinese speak Mandarin. There are quite literally hundreds of Chinese languages out there. Mandarin is a semi artificial dialect, basically, that people have standardized and used as the common language so that people can communicate because otherwise our dialects and languages are too different. So for me, it's because I identify with the language, with my family ancestry, with the land that they came from, and with the ongoing struggle to make sure that this place that I come from, that people there live better lives. Um, that's going to be different for someone who maybe identifies as Chinese in Hong Kong, who are speaking Cantonese, which is a completely separate language that I don't understand a word of, even though I speak Mandarin. Or for someone, rare person in Taiwan these days who still identifies as culturally Chinese. There's not many of them, but they're there. They might speak Hokkien or Hakka, which I also don't understand a word of, even though I speak Mandarin Chinese. So I think there's just a huge diversity of Chinese identities, all of which are equally valid. But for me, I identify with a certain type of Chinese identity. And I am open to other people who think so too, but might look, act, and dress differently than me.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. I really, really appreciate it. We're talking to NPR journalist Emily Feng about her new book, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, Identity and Belonging in Xi Jinping's China. Thank you so much for talking to me. I do really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.